5.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the third in our series of events celebrating 50 years of teaching and research in systems thinking in practice at the OU. We're delighted to be joined today by Professor Michael Jackson from the University of Hull. My name is Dr. Magnus Ramage. I've been a member of the systems group at the OU for 20 years, authoring and chairing systems modules at undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and I'm author with my colleague Kieran Shipp of the book Systems Thinkers, which outlines the life and work of 30 key thinkers in the field, including our speaker today. Today's session will last for an hour. Mike will speak for about 20 minutes, then we'll have roughly 30 minutes of questions and answers, followed by a closing reflection and notices and such by Dr. Martin Reynolds. This talk is being broadcast live on Zoom and also on YouTube and Facebook. So please put your comments in whichever platform that you're using, and I will do my best to pose them to Mike on your behalf. So you write them, I'll speak them. It's possible that we won't get through them all, but we shall see. The session is being recorded, and it will be available shortly after the event through the Faculty of Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths YouTube and Facebook channels. So I'm very privileged to introduce you to Mike Jackson. Mike is one of the most prominent figures in UK systems scholarship. He took an MA in Systems in Management at Lancaster in 1978. He's been based at the University of Hull for almost all the time since then, taking his PhD there and becoming a full professor before retiring in 2012. Mike has written many books and articles on how to deal with complex systemic problems of management, presenting elegant and erudite overviews of a wide range of different systems thinking techniques and concepts. He's especially associated with the concept of critical systems thinking, a field to which he gave a name and which he largely defined, and which he'll be talking about today. For many years, Mike was editor-in-chief of the journal Systems Research and Behavioural Science, and has been president of several international systems societies, including the UK Systems Society, the International Society for the System Sciences, and the International Federation for Systems Research. I believe I've only met Mike once in person, but I've admired his work for many years. I first encountered his work as a PhD student in Lancaster, when I was a PhD student in Lancaster, reading through things that Mike had written in a journal called the Journal of Applied Systems Analysis, that was published from there, and which there's not many archive copies of left in the world, but Lancaster has a set and the OU has a set. And I was really struck by the energy of this critical voice who was unafraid to take on the powerful in his own field as well as outside of it. I've read many of Mike's books and articles since then and really valued his writing. It was a delight to write about him in my own book. So it's a great honour to hand over the virtual stage to Mike Jackson.
Thank you very much, Magnus, for that nice introduction. I shall try and live up to it. Just a few slides, which I shall put up. Okay, first of all, to say how pleased I am and a privilege to contribute to this Open University celebration, 50 years of systems thinking. I'm really happy to do this. The Open University has been flourishing as a mainstay of systems thinking in the UK now for 50 years. That's incredible achievement. Trouble for me is that I remember more than 40 years of it since I've been active in systems thinking during that time. So I have a memory of much of the Open University's work, has become somehow some kind of elder statesman of systems thinking, and deemed worthy of commenting on the Open University's work and the issues in systems thinking. Anyway, it's great to be here. These are some of the things that I remember from my early involvement, in which the Open University was particularly influential. I was at Lancaster in 1977-78, doing my master's degree in systems in management, as it was then. It was in 1977, the OU, we know, is 50 years old, but it was in 1977, where at the OU's initiative, the system group's initiative, the 4 universities that were at that time teaching systems thinking in any large fashion, Aston, City, Lancaster, and the Open University, came together in the so-called Barford group. They met at a small town called Barford, which is equidistant between those 4 places, Aston, City, Lancaster, and the Open University's base. And from that emerged the UK Systems Society, again, largely an initiative of the Open University. And digging around in my files, I managed to find the first 4 issues of the UK Systems Society newsletter, and you possibly won't be too surprised to hear that many of the things that they were talking about then, we still talk about in systems today. And then the OU was influential and was the main organizer of what was possibly the best conference of the Society for General Systems Research, its silver anniversary conference in London, that I attended. A really good event, bringing together many of the important systems thinkers at that time. And the proceedings are still worth looking at. I managed to dig those out and have a look at them. And it was the OU that was the organizer of that. And again, in 1980, the OU was behind the inaugural UKSS conference. I think that was held at the City University, but the OU was the main, systems group was the main organizer. John Byshon, who was the chair of the OU systems group at that time, coordinated a session between Philip Macpherson, who was labelled the main proponent of the positivist trend in systems thinking in the UK, set against Peter Checkland, who was labelled the main proponent of the phenomenological trend in systems thinking in the UK. And they had a nice debate. I remember being there, and Philip Macpherson being more sophisticated perhaps than Peter thought he might be in that particular debate. And the OU has continued to develop its courses since then. Seen many students at master's level and at the levels go through, and it's been great to see a resurgence in recent years, particularly because of Ray Eison's contribution, and of course the contribution of our 2 people here today, Magnus and Martin, and others in that group. Is systems thinking any stronger today than it was back then? In some ways, no. We're probably weaker in the university sector than we were then. There's not much systematic systems teaching at Aston, City, and Lancaster, which is means it's all more of a tribute to the Open University for having kept going. On the other hand, there's much more interest in systems thinking these days from all kinds of types of organisation. And I think we have more potential to deliver. We've learned our stuff. We've learned how to use it and how to employ it to deal with complexity. And I think we're in a better position to deliver it, but we've probably not fully yet lived up to our potential. But I'll come back to that later in the talk. So if Aston, City and Lancaster have over the past 50 years dropped out, it's perhaps good that there was a new kid on the block, as it were, joined the Open University during that period in promoting systems ideas. It was my first academic role at Hull. I joined Hull in 1979. I hadn't been I'd been in the civil service before that. And so I was quite shocked to join academia. It was an operational research department. They gave me, well, as usual, they dumped all their lecturing on me. But even so, it was only about 5 or 6 hours a week. And I didn't really know what to do with the rest of my time. Academics amazed me and still continue to amaze me. They have what I consider the best job in the world, but all they did was actually sit around moaning about it. And it wasn't until Paul Keyes arrived in 1980 at Hull, and I asked him, what are we supposed to be doing with all this time we had? And he said, well, we're supposed to be doing research. So I said, oh, okay, well, we better get on with it then. So you can probably trace systems thinking at Hull, or critical systems thinking, back 40 years to around about 1981, when Paul Keyes and I got together and started a research program looking at the different strengths and weaknesses of different systems approaches. And the Centre for Systems Studies, which was the main vehicle, has been the main vehicle for promoting the type of systems thinking promulgated by Hull, was formed in 1992. So that's nearly 30 years old now. It was founded by Bob Flood and myself, and since then it's had a number of prominent directors, Gerald Midgley, after myself and Bob, Jennifer Wilby, Wendy Gregory, I think, Yasmin Morali. Nowadays there are co-directors, Gerald Midgley and Amanda Gregory. So still going strong after 30 years. So that's an achievement, I think, and one of the things that we've managed to achieve at Hull. These other items here are the things that I think we've done well at Hull in establishing and promoting. And they're the elements of what came to be called critical systems thinking. So I'd still say those are the 3 most important commitments of critical systems thinking at Hull and elsewhere where that label's used. So the first of those is critical awareness. And this is establishing the strengths and weaknesses of different systems approaches. It's reasonable to see the beginning of that commitment as being Peter Checkland's critique of hard systems thinking as a way of establishing the differences between that and his own soft systems thinking. But I think that particular aspect of systems thinking has been pursued most intensely at Hull, with a look at the whole variety of different systems approaches, trying to establish their various strengths and weaknesses, both in theory, the use of social theory to see the assumptions, the theoretical assumptions they were making, and by testing them in practice. And we've been through most of the systems methodologies and the major systems approaches as part of that endeavour. And my most recent book, the 2019 Critical Systems Thinking, the Management of Complexity, looks at 10 prominent systems methodologies from the point of view of critical awareness, what would perhaps now be called second order critique, looking at the way that those different systems and methodologies look at the world, social reality, and on the basis of that, how they attempt to change the world and the impact that has upon their capacity to do good systems work. So I think that is something we did well at Hull. Once you become aware that different systems approaches have different strengths and weaknesses, I think you're led almost automatically to a pluralistic a pluralistic position. You start to say, well, if some methodologies are good at one thing and some other systems approaches are good at other things, perhaps we should start to use them in combination with a full awareness of the variety of strengths and weaknesses that they bring to the table. This wasn't unique to Hull. In the early days of the Open University, there were studies of, I think in systems behavior, there were studies of, of course, hard systems approaches were seen as useful, so soft systems approaches, and a failures approach was in there as well. But the pursuit of a pluralistic approach to systems thinking has seen, as I think being a hallmark of the whole critical systems tradition. A significant element of that, particularly in the early days, was the system of systems methodologies, which allowed you to have a look at what different systems approaches assumed about the complexity of the world that they were facing and the nature and the relationship between the stakeholders involved in any problematic situation with which they were engaged. And the systems methodologies allowed not just hard and soft systems approaches to be incorporated within one overall critical systems viewpoint, but also things like system dynamics and the viable system model and critical systems heuristics. And I think I'd want to argue that it's still a good way of teaching how systems thinking has developed in relation to its understanding and its greater understanding over time of the nature of complexity. And it's a map of the territory, and despite what its critics say, it allows you to chart how different systems, models and methods move over that territory as people use them in different ways over time. And then the radical change agenda. I was keen to, when I was at Lancaster, to critique Checkland's work for its failure to understand and deal properly with power relationships and inequalities. Paul Keyes and I introduced the notion of coercive dimensions to the system of systems methodologies. We promoted Werner Ulrich's critical systems heuristics when it came to the fore in the 1983, his book was in the late 1980s, and saw it as one of the major vehicles for systems thinking taking on the radical change agenda. We pursued that agenda at Hull, and through the Community Operational Research Initiative did so in practice as well. But some of that work as well was going on at the OU. I remember the 1979 conference, a paper by Alan Thomas, who was at the OU at that time, and Martin Lockett, called Marxism and Systems Research. And they presented that. They were also at that conference extremely rude to one of the great gurus of systems thinking, Kenneth Boulding. And I thought, well, maybe you can be rude to the gurus of the systems community as well. And maybe I took some of that nerve, that an ability to challenge the systems gurus from that Magnus was talking about, from watching Alan Thomas and Martin Lockett have a go at Boulding. What's still to be done in terms of critical systems thinking at Hull? Well, in the early days, we had a kind of this is about still trying to work out some of the philosophical and theoretical assumptions behind critical systems thinking. In the early days, we adopted a kind of meta paradigm approach based upon Habermas's work, Bob and I. And that wasn't really satisfactory. It was standing above and trying to allocate different methodologies according to some meta-paradigmatic overseeing perspective. Didn't really work because all the different paradigms had things to say about different problem situations. I think we're still struggling in this area. Gerald Midgley has the notion that we need to say that critical system thinking is its own paradigm and establish it as a paradigm in its own right. John Mingus looks for a paradigm that will host critical systems thinking without detracting from its commitments and its tenets, and sees critical realism as a paradigm that can, an approach that can do that. I don't favour either of those two positions, because I don't think that one paradigm pluralism is really pluralism, and you'll find a lot of people who disagree with the process paradigm that Gerald puts forward and the critical realist paradigm that John puts forward. So I lean to a sort of pragmatist view. There is no overarching viewpoint from which to look at the world. You look at it from different lenses, through different paradigms, and you critique different paradigms through the lenses of other paradigms. It's critique between the paradigms. And I think pragmatism gives us the kind of ontological, epistemological, methodological flexibility that we need for multi-methodological work. But that means to establish that theoretical background, there's a hell of a lot of reading and new work that needs doing by me and others. There are some important links there between, based upon the work of Ernst Mach, who influenced Bogdanov, perhaps the first rigorous systems thinker in the early years of the 20th century, and also influenced the pragmatists, particularly William James. So there's some interesting links there that need pursuing. Critical systems practice, what's been achieved at Hull. This work derives originally from the thing that Bob Flood and I developed called total systems intervention. But I was talking to Bob recently and I said to him, wasn't a very good name, was it, total systems intervention? And he said, no, it's probably the worst name we could possibly have given it. And I think somehow he's right. And there are other approaches that have developed out of Hull as well, Gerald Midgley's systemic intervention. But this is where I am with critical systems practice at the moment. 4 elements to it if you want a multi-methodological approach. And the first, exploring the problem situation, there are 2 terms there that I would highlight. There's the acceptance in Edgar Morin's terms that we're dealing with general complexity, not, as he would put it, restricted complexity. With restricted complexity, you stay within the bounds of the scientific tradition and think you can model the world. And that's perhaps the way that system dynamics often tends to go, and agent-based modeling. With general complexity, you regard the complexity that we face as far too multidimensional and problematic to seek to model it using just one approach. You can't come to terms with this complexity. All you can use is various partial truths. And so the problem becomes not ontological, but epistemological, cognitive, paradigmatic. The way people see the world and therefore act upon the world becomes the main thing to study and to look at. And I want to do that to get to grips with general complexity in exploring the problematic world using systemic perspectives, as I now call them. So we certainly got to knock people out of mechanistic thinking, but I don't believe that leads us to a free-for-all, a whole host of different metaphors, or any kind of way of viewing the world is useful. I think we have developed over time a set of what Lakoff and Johnson would call experiential gestalts, or Pepper would call world hypotheses, which do give us some sort of traction on the way the world is and how we can survive best in it and intervene best to promote the human species within it. And I have sought to distill those from Pepper's work, Lakoff and Johnson's work, sociological paradigms and metaphors, and would want to promote the notion that it's useful to come to terms with general complexity by viewing it through machine, organism, purposeful system, societal, environmental, and interrelationships perspectives. From 5 different lenses there, which are experiential gestalts that have served us well over time, and which are useful for us to take forward in trying to come to terms with general complexity. On that basis, we need, I think, a multi-paradigm, multi-methodology, multi-method approach based upon critical awareness of the strengths and weaknesses of different systems, approaches, methodologies, and methods to produce an intervention strategy. And critical systems thinking has developed an ideal type of multi-paradigm, multi-methodology, multi-method approach, which of course in any real world situation needs adjusting to the circumstances because you can't carry out in any real world situation because of various constraints that ideal type. You have to intervene flexibly on the basis of what the explore stage of this multi-methodology has told you are the most important issues to deal with now. But always continuing to view the problem situation through a variety of paradigms, perspectives, and cognitive lenses, so that you can change and be flexible in the intervention as the world itself changes and your view of it changes. And you check on improvements on your ability to have brought about some kind of beneficial change from multiple perspectives as well. And I think that the establishment of many of those things central to the whole critical systems practice view has been important. And Gerald Midgley's critical systemic intervention has much more in common with this than it has differences, though there are differences. And critical systems practice at Hull, and I'm coming to some sort of conclusion now, I think faces the same challenge as systems thinking or applied systems thinking in practice everywhere. And so this is a common challenge for us at Hull and a common challenge for the Open University going forward, I think. What needs doing, what still needs doing in critical systems practice. We cannot but notice the huge demand there is for systems thinking, which is articulated by the UN, by UNESCO, by the World Health Organization, and so on and so on. I could list all sorts of organizations in the public, the private, the international sectors who are calling for a systems approach to deal with complexity. But we're perhaps at the moment failing to show how we can meet that significant demand. And we have to do better there. It's incredible that we're not more established in universities. The Open University is doing well. Hull remains in existence and is strong. But I can't see systems thinking flourishing in too many institutions. There are individual systems thinkers, but it isn't flourishing in too many institutions. The traditional disciplines are still strong. The research excellence framework doesn't help in bringing forward transdisciplinary work. It's not easy to see the benefits of systems thinking unless you've experienced complex problems. So it's not easily taught at undergraduate level, but we certainly have a case for much more work in universities, given the demand for systems thinking that's out there. Not that we've succeeded in convincing all practitioners who want to take a systems approach. I'm amazed when I hear so much talk about systems leadership But those people very often don't ask the question, what kind of systems, what we think about the systems we're leading, what's our view of the systems we're leading, what are the systems like that we're trying to lead. In health systems research, there's a massive community of who meet periodically, 2,000 people at their conferences, but they never or very rarely consider the kind of systems that they're trying to improve. There's no meeting of minds between the systems community per se and areas like health systems research. As far as they consider it at all, they label health systems complex adaptive systems and then take a system dynamics approach to it. They're not taking advantage of the full gamut, the full range of systems approaches that we know are important and have traction. And that's true of systems engineers and of project managers. And I'm talking to conferences of all those people in coming months, trying to convince them of the value of the multi-methodological approaches, taking advantage of what has been achieved in systems thinking. And I hope they listen. Inevitably, another issue is with such demand out there, the supply has grown, but it's variable in quality. A lot of consultants are jumping on the bandwagon and offering what they call systems courses, but they know nothing of the history of systems thinking or the range of systems approaches. Often they're simplistic system dynamics approaches, or the label systems thinking is just being used without any respect for the tradition. Partially our fault, of course, for not having established that tradition better. So I'm working or trying to work hard and looking to the future of systems thinking in practice. I'm working with others on the Critical Systems Forum, which tries to link the systems ideas we've been developing to major issues of the day, bringing in people from outside the systems community to try and interest them in systems ideas. And often they're saying they have an interest in systems ideas, and we're trying to make that link. But you do get issues there, because what is proper systems thinking? And therefore I'm looking at the establishment of a Critical Systems Institute, which somehow can provide some, some credibility to the well-established systems approaches that we have been developing at Hull and at the Open University over the years. And perhaps that can lead to a think tank where systems ideas are expressed and seek to address the major issues of the day. And to conclude, finally, my attempt to put the ideas into practice, into print theoretically, was this huge tome, 700 pages, Critical System Thinking and Management Complexity, where the things I've been talking about are more fully described, but it is a huge tome with 700 pages. And so I'm starting in September working on a series of conversations with practitioners who have an interest in systems thinking, and will attempt to produce some kind of practitioner's guide to critical systems thinking with their help, with them telling me which of the ideas in critical systems thinking actually seem to have the most relevance to their practice in the wide range of areas from which I hope I will be able to draw people into this conversation. So thank you very much. Tribute to the Open University for going for 50 years. We've still more work to do, and I hope that many people will join the efforts of the Open University and the Centre for Systems in Hull in pursuing this vital work in systems thinking. Thank you.
We don't get virtual clapping, of course, on this platform. Thank you very much, Mike. That was really interesting and really insightful, and you covered a lot of ground in that short space of time that you were allowed. And I would amplify to anyone the opportunity to read Mike's most recent book, which really is very good and very comprehensive. And those who study or work at the OU, there's an ebook copy available through our library. You can dip into it without necessarily having the Oh, brave, but it is great.
My silence, Magnus.
So we have a bunch of questions that have been arriving. I'm going to try and address as many as possible tonight. The first one I thought would be quite insightful comes from Barry, who asks, what advice would you give to somebody such as a PhD student who's setting out to challenge the gurus today?
Right. Do it and don't be put off. I remember after this is a long time ago. People call me a young Turk. A strange word in the systems union with that particular challenge that I did in. I mean, the paper came out in 1982, I think. Looking at the systems work of Checkland, Akoff, and Churchman, that was a bit cheeky, really, in some ways. And I remember seeing Akoff at a conference in Washington in 1982, and after I'd written that paper and he'd read it, and he was in the process of doing a reply to it, and I said to him, "Oh, Russ, what did you think of the paper?" And he said, "Well, I don't think you've understood one thing I've ever written." He was an aggressive character, was Russ, but he took the time to talk to me, and we became really good friends over a long period of time until he died, and I benefited one hell of a lot from his help and his assistance. So don't be put off by anything of the kind that I got from Russ Akoff. I'm happy to see anybody taking these ideas forward. They are, in my view, still the most crucial ideas that can help us to get to grips with complexity. And there's a world out there for people interested in systems thinking to do useful work. So by all means, challenge the gurus of today. Although I actually hope we're past the age of gurus. I think systems thinking is broader, and I think the multi-methodological the debate has been won, if you like, thanks to the Open University and thanks to the work at Hull, and thanks to people like John Mingus and John Bucklesby and Richard Ormerod. Nobody, well, there are a few obviously, but most people see beyond simply one systems approach and no longer just worship either the viable system model or soft systems methodology or the Vanguard method or whatever. They see the value in a range of systems approaches, and that's the way forward for the transdiscipline and whatever newly useful things that can be brought to the fore by fresh blood and fresh PhD students who we vitally need.
Brilliant, thank you. So a question to follow on from that, I think. I don't know the author of this question, but they have written, do you think that systems thinking has too many approaches, theories, methodologies, many of which contradict each other? Could this limit the take-up of systems thinking by other disciplines? Maybe STIP should itself be the subject of STIP analysis with the aim of achieving some education and simplification. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're facing a highly complex, multidimensional world, and as many people have said, when you're facing that degree of complexity, simple solutions are not the answer. They tend to make things worse, and we could all provide examples of that happening. That said, we have to be able to pass on the lessons of the past in a way which is coherent and understandable to future generations. So we have to find ways of doing that. Not simply the systems lessons are not an easy lesson. So we must find ways of doing that without losing the power of systems thinking and its capabilities. So how do we make this material understandable and usable without losing its sophistication and making it into a method or a tool which simply is ill-equipped to get to grips with the complexity that we face? So it's certainly something that I've struggled with, but I think I've got to grips with it in a way that, well, at least I find useful, and I hope others will. And it's this notion that there are certain systemic ways of looking at the world which have proven useful over time. And you can relate to those, and I say there are 5 from my trawl, which I think is being fairly inclusive of world hypotheses and metaphors and social theory, etc. And if you say that, machine, organism, purposeful system, those are 3 Akoff terms, incidentally. The societal, environmental, where you take into account the impact of any system's design upon society and the environment, and the key systems notion of interrelationships. 5 lenses there, and you can relate different systems approaches to those 5 lenses. So if you're faced with this massive complexity, it's worth using these 5 experiential gestalts to explore it. And then on the basis of what you learn, you can employ the different systems approaches according to what are the major problems that come to the fore in that exploration phase. So if the main issues that come to the fore are the need to improve efficiency and efficacy, then there's huge value in using mechanical systems approaches of the kind that Deming has championed and the Vanguard method in the UK. On the other hand, if the issues of disagreement about purpose and what you're seeking to achieve, and different stakeholder perspectives of pluralism, if you like, in a problem situation, then you're led to purposeful systems approaches of a soft systems kind. So and so on. So I don't think it's hard. I think the systems material can be fitted, if you like, reasonably without distorting it too much into those approaches which privilege a machine worldview, an organismic worldview, a purposeful systems worldview, a societal environmental worldview, and an interrelationships worldview. I think I can fit the major systems approaches into those. And because I'm using that now, that relates directly to those 5 different worldviews, to 5 different ways of perceiving complexity. I don't think that's too difficult to grasp and to understand and to start using.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think it's really incisive as an approach. I've got a pair of questions here. The questions are beginning to come in a bit faster, so I'll try and combine them if there's commonalities. A pair of questions about the institutional take-up of systems approaches. So one person says, with such a high demand for critical systems, why do you think there hasn't been a greater uptake of STIP teaching at university level? And then Barbara says, how can the systems departments that are still going strong align their capacities better across institutions and in different countries to avoid further fragmentation and to risk falling into oblivion and getting back to the strengths that we had 40 or 50 years ago?
Yeah, strengths 40, 50 years ago, it was certainly established in more settings 40 or 50 years ago, I think, in universities. We mentioned Aston, City, Open University in Lancaster. 3 of those have now gone. You could probably also look at cybernetics at Brunel at that time, and socio-technical systems thinking was still going at Tavistock Institute. I didn't mention those, but maybe in terms of institutional settings, it was stronger, yes. But I don't think it was stronger in terms of the way we've managed to create a transdiscipline which respects the different systems viewpoints, and in our ability to practice systems ideas. I think we've learned that better. But to the answer to the question directly, I just don't know. The university sector, I despair of in all kinds of different ways. Not least, of course, because of this. When the world is calling out for systems thinking, it is the international institutions, it is charitable institutions, it is business, it is the professions, the engineering, mechanical engineers said recently all their people need training in systems thinking. You could go across the board, so many different places saying that. And yet universities are just not responding. Of course, there is the grip, as I mentioned, of the traditional disciplines, which makes it hard for transdisciplinary approaches to come to the fore. You almost need to reorganize your university but transdisciplinary approaches are absolutely essential for dealing with complex problems. No complex problem is gonna be resolved by one discipline. You have to be transdisciplinary, and so you do despair that systems departments struggle so much in institutions like universities. It's not popular among undergraduates, as I mentioned as well. It's hard to convince undergraduates of it because it's dealing with issues that you only really comes to your attention and you start to meet when you actually start when you become a manager and you go outside the institution, or at least you start trying to practice the ideas. I certainly didn't understand Checkland's soft systems methodology until I started trying to use it in earnest, in the field. So these are not easy ideas to get across at undergraduate level. But why the institutions are not responding to that external need is perhaps beyond me. In terms of international connections, then there are some institutions which are doing better internationally, and I think there are strong foci of attention on systems thinking in Australia, less so in the States. Ray Eisen is doing his best to try and get the International Federation of Systems Research working again. There's a lot of work to be done, but it's the most essential work anybody could be doing, I think, because I still feel the value of systems thinking given the issues we face. Sorry, I don't have an answer.
Well, it's a very difficult question, isn't it? And it's a very vexed question that sort of has rumbled around for a long time. I have an even worse question for you, or even harder question for you, which I might ask you to answer quickly because there's lots of other things that we might come to. So Yi asks, it seems difficult to publish systems thinking papers in 4-star ABS journals. I guess that's the Association of Business Schools. Do you have any suggestions?
Stop trying to. It is, and it's the same. A lot of the journals in the area of management science, if you like, and I'm interested in the application of systems ideas to management science, operations research in the States, require mathematical content. And this is one of the functions of the ref, and probably an unintended consequence, but it means that people feel they have to direct their papers. Even dedicated systems people feel they're working in academia, who want to get on and get promoted, feel they have to direct their papers to 4-star journals. That makes life difficult for them. Although there is the Journal of the ORs, the European Journal of the ORs, the European Journal of Operational Research, which is 4-star now. But it also detracts them from sending their papers to systems journals. And I know well, you mentioned, Magnus, that I was editor of systems research and behavioral science for 26 years. It's a job when people are sending their best papers to other journals because the ref is forcing them and their universities are forcing them to do that. People in the ref are saying, they won't take any account of these lists of how good journals are. So I would encourage people to send their best papers, and I'm no longer editor, so I'm no longer making a private case for this, send their best papers to journals like Systems Research and Behavioural Science and Systems Practice and Action Research, and I suppose that the impact of that will be that gradually the best papers going there, the most cited papers, then they will become 4-star journals. But yeah, it's a crazy game.
It is crazy. Couple of different sorts of questions I think we might go to. Helen asks that she says that our experience at the OU shows that practitioners can become convinced, but the problem is for many students of systems thinking in practice that they're alone in their organizations. What advice would you give to a practitioner about how to go about convincing their colleagues?
Well, that's a difficult one. Yeah, I can see that lone voice issue. You certainly don't bash them over the head with systems thinking and systems terminology. You introduce it when it seems relevant, and there are ways of doing that, which I think the OU is particularly good at helping people with. So it is a matter of you have to go, as Checkland would say, I guess, use it to help with the ongoing process of management and change in an organization. Don't try and impose it from the top, else you will put people off. But there will be many circumstances where you can introduce system concepts and systems ideas and gradually gain interest in them, and people will ask eventually where these ideas come from, and you can honestly start to tell them that they're systems ideas or cybernetic ideas and they appear to be relevant to them. John Seddon and Rosakov are convinced you have to show them how bad their organizations are operating now in order to start to convince them that they need to improve and to try something different. And Seddon has his check approach where you look at how badly the organization's meeting its customer needs. Rosakov says, get your organization to look at the future it's locked into if it doesn't do anything. Those are techniques which can help as well.
Brilliant, thank you. We're coming near to the end of the time for questions, so I've got two more that I'll try and squeeze in. John says, what are Mike's thoughts on the work being undertaken in Europe on systems-oriented design, SOD, especially the work by Birger Sevelson regarding many links to many aspects of systems thinking?
I'm not up enough on that work, Magnus, but there are clearly important links between systems thinking and design thinking, and I'm glad that that's being explored again.
Yeah, I agree. And historically, in the OU, it's been very relevant.
Mm.
And I think this might be our last question, but this will be a nice one to end on. Louise asks, if you could recommend 3 books for somebody new to the field, what would you suggest to get a feel for systems thinking? And I would add that you're allowed to recommend your own book, but you don't have to.
I won't recommend my own book. Well, 3, that's really difficult. 3 is really difficult. I'll recommend yours with Karen Shipp, Magnus, the Systems Thinkers. But that's cheating because I'm in that. So I can have 3 more. So it would have to be a Checkland, a Beer, and an Akoff probably.
Mm-hmm.
Checkland Systems Thinking, Systems Practice. Beer, which one would I go for? Probably still Brain of the Firm, 2nd edition. And Russ Akoff's Best, or Creating the Corporate Future.
So real classics rather than sort of more modern books, mostly. That's really interesting.
In other areas, well, you wanted three, so I'm not going to go on. But Dunella Meadows is good on system dynamics, of course, and well, yeah,
Yeah, the list could go on.
they
But
could. I hope I've incorporated most of them in my book at least, and sought to pay tribute to most of those books.
But I'll repeat those back in case anyone was wanting to write them down. So you said Russ Acuff's, was it Creating the Conditions of the Firm? That one.
He has one called Acuff's Best,
Oh, yeah.
which is some of his articles,
And
one called Creating the Corporate Future.
and then Brain of the Firm by Stafford Beer.
The second edition, yeah.
Oh, yes. And Peter Checkland's original one, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. I think we're out of time for questions, so I'm going to hand over to Martin to kind of wrap us off. And thank you ever so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Magnus, and hello everyone, and thank you, Mike. It was always a pleasure to hear from you, and it's great hearing your thoughts, particularly about critical systems thinking. Mike and I first met some 20 years back, just over 20 years ago, when I was appointed as a research assistant at the Centre for Systems Studies at Hull University to work with Joel Mitchley on a project on environmental management and systems thinking approaches. Before that appointment, I was very much accustomed to the use of critical systems thinking through my doctorate studies at the Institute for Development Policy and Management in Manchester, looking particularly at critical systems heuristics in terms of looking at international interventions. And for me, critical systems thinking, it provided that space, and Mike was absolutely instrumental in doing this. It provided that space to make transparent the politics and ethics of interventions in general, and particularly with systems thinking. And it's that transparency which, for me, is a key word here. It underpins for me the value of systems thinking in practice in supporting interventions. Interventions, whether they're community development, whether they're environmental management, health, business, engineering, whatever, they all require making boundary judgments, making judgments or framing judgments, whether they're explicit or implicit, whether they're judgments of fact around the interrelationships around a particular situation of interest, or judgments of value about engaging with different perspectives, with multiple perspectives. And of course, facts don't speak for themselves. They're mediated through our values by boundary judgments. And for me, the joy of systems thinking in practice in general is this exploring the interplay between judgments of fact and value judgments through boundary judgments, through systems boundaries. And that for me is the crux not only of critical systems thinking, but systems thinking in practice in general. And again, just from my perspective, I think there's a couple of questions that come up. And these are questions that regularly arise, I guess, from my engagement with critical systems thinking and listening to you today, actually, Mike. The first question really is about the framing of systems thinking in practice and its use, the use of this divide between hard systems, soft systems, and critical systems thinking, which has been a really powerful way of explaining and framing the way in which systems thinking has evolved over the last century, actually, in Western thought, it has to be said, and so that's really good and really helpful. And then we talk about it in terms of three waves of thinking. But I do wonder whether the categorization, that kind of categorization, can impede the criticality of all systems thinking in practice. I mean, critical systems thinking is almost like a tautology. I mean, systems thinking should be critical, whichever sort of tradition that we are looking at. And hard systems thinkers and soft systems thinkers, they do have elements of criticality, and they potentially, obviously, ought to have that element of criticality. So I just pose it there as a particular question. I think you touched on it a little bit, Mike, in your talk about critical systems practice and the role of pragmatism in particular, which I also enjoy. I think there's a huge amount of value around American pragmatism in particular. But also the recent work that you've done on Bogdanov from Russia as well. The second question is a question about the language of critical systems thinking. And this is the question not just about the language of CST, but the language of systems thinking in practice in general. And there's a sort of question about, does the language itself undermine the transparency of, or the potential transparency of systems thinking in practice in general? Does it impede the kind of transition that we're looking for from looking at systems thinking in practice as an endeavor which is very much determined either academically or through consultancy? And it actually puts a kind of a restraint on the move towards systems thinking in practice as public work, which is where I think we should be going. We should be moving towards having systems thinking in practice out there for the public. So it provides not only a space for academics and consultants, think tanks to think about or whatever and deliberate about, but for people, for citizens to talk about and deliberate on the politics and the ethics of any intervention that is out there. And I think there's a huge potential for systems thinking in practice to move along that way. I think it addresses the kind of questions that have been raised in the discussion today about gurus and multi-methodologies. There was one question as well that I saw in the chat, which unfortunately wasn't covered, but around the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonizing of systems thinking as a language as well. So I wonder if there's potential, a lot more potential to be had in trying to customize existing practices, existing management practices from different traditions with the ideas of systems thinking in practice, these ideas that have evolved over many, many years, taking them outside of the constraints of the systems approach from which they derive and applying them to these existing practices, these existing languages. And of course, by languages, we're talking about languages outside of the English language. So those are the two kind of questions that I think that are raised in your talk. It does lead me on to announce the next event that we have to celebrate the 50 years of systems thinking at the Open University. And this is being scheduled for the 27th of July. There is a link in the chat that's been provided for registration for this event. And it's being presented by Dr. Sharon Pollard from South Africa. And Sharon has been very active with her organization Award. She's the executive director of Award around poverty alleviation in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly around South Africa and Mozambique. The topic of that talk is systemic praxis for water governance. And she's asking the question, basically, which I think is very apposite to this presentation, which is it an unnecessary divergence, this talk about systemic praxis, or is it an essential framing that is required there? So on that, I would like to, again, thank Mike for an excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Mike. And it was an enjoyable journey going through with you on the history of critical systems thinking. I'd like to thank Magnus, my colleague, Magnus Ramage, for introducing Mike, and for his excellent orchestration of the questions. And finally, I'd like to thank our media backup team from the Open University, led by Katrina Bray, with help from colleagues including Sam Hazel. So with that, from me and the Applied Systems Thinking in Practice group at the Open University, I bid you a fond farewell, and thank you all for attending this event, and I look forward to seeing some familiar names again for future events. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.